Hello and welcome. My name's Ramon. This video is about an urn that I was recently commissioned to make. The box overall is quite simple, but there is some detail and quality that takes time. I'm going to show you my process straight from the beginning to create something that's extremely rewarding to me, but also meaningful to others. I found a beautiful board of cherry and I flattened it on both sides and made one edge straight at the jointer. I've shown this simple shop-made jig before. It's an easy way to set up a bandsaw fence super accurately. And here I'm going to use some 1/2-inch drill bits, but you could also use spacers. So by utilizing 2 drill bit cases, I can set up that fence to the 1/64th of an inch. The concept is simple. So the left side of my jig is in direct alignment with the left side of the blade, including the teeth. You'll notice a notch for the bandsaw blade, and now this means that whatever spacer I use between the left side of the jig and the fence, that's exactly what size thickness of material that I'll produce. It's fantastic. I first came up with this idea when I used to teach marquetry classes and I was cutting a lot of shop sawn veneer. I needed an accurate way to routinely and quickly cut 1/16 inch shop sawn veneers. It's extremely accurate and certainly easier than trying to use a factory fence with the scale that is just going to get you close. All right, this is fun. Check it out. So here's the board that we just split in half, right? And so you can see how closely the grain matches, doing an end match. So that end matches. Of course, this end also has to match. You can see it's pretty close right there, but if I was to bring this one up to about right there, it's a perfect match. So what we can do, we can utilize this, splitting this board into making all 4 sides of the box and all 4 corners, the grain will match. You couldn't do that if you took it out of one long board. Of course, 3 corners would match, but when that corner came to this one, the grain would be off. So that's one way to do a 4-corner box match. A buddy of mine, actually my neighbor, gave me this aspen wood. It's really white and it's a great substitute for American holly. You can see these are pretty warped. So I'll take those over to the joiner, get them flat, and slice them into 1/16 inch thick veneer, about 1.5 millimeters. And I also cut some cherry, the same thickness. I've talked about this Easy Tack before. It's fantastic. It's basically a repositionable contact adhesive, or you can spray both pieces for a super strong bond. With double bevel marquetry, we're using 2 pieces of veneer cut at the same time. So the aspen is the background and the cherry that's taped underneath. That will become the letters or the inset piece. Here, the first part of the letter I has been cut, and so those 2 pieces are actually wedged or tapered, and the cherry piece is actually bigger, and that makes up for the saw kerf. So think of the pieces as pyramid shaped. And here you can see I've slipped the piece in from the back, and it creates a super tight fit. This will probably make more sense as I continue. Of course, I start with making a small hole for the saw blade, and keep in mind that this donkey or this platform is angled for this particular thickness of veneer at a 1/16. The donkey is angled at 10.5 degrees. So I simply thread the blade through the hole and make the cut. You can see I'm rotating the material and keeping my blade straight up and down, which produces that pyramid shape of the 2 pieces that I cut. And you may have noticed the left tip of my left index finger is missing. Yeah, I can only count to about 9 3/16. That was not done with a table saw or a skill saw or any kind of saw. Actually, an equally dumb accident when I was about 11 years old, crashed a motorcycle. My finger literally went through the chain and sprocket, pinched it off. And hopefully this gives you a better view of the process. You drill a hole, thread the blade through, make the cut, lather, rinse, repeat. Then it's just a matter of adding a little bit of glue all the way around the perimeter and hammering the piece in place. They flush up on the front. It's fantastic. So with this method, it's a little bit challenging to cut inside corners, sharp inside corners. Outside corners are easy to do because it's just the nature of the the way the saw is cutting. So here I had two inside corners, one there and one there. So rather than cutting that out as one piece, I cut it out two separate pieces. I cut this one, then I shifted the back piece over slightly. You can see how it's sticking out. And now I'll glue that piece in, recut that just at that edge. It's still going to be cut at a bevel since this piece is beveled. And then I can slip that in and marry those two right at that transition. Incidentally, one really cool thing about this process is I just now glued that in. You can see the glue is still wet, and I can start cutting that immediately. That piece is locked in. And it's vastly important to get a full bead of glue all the way around the perimeter. Even if you have too much, it's just going to squeeze out. Not a big shake, but too little could show up as a gap. And I love this little hammer. It's convex on one face. Makes it ideal for driving those pieces home. All right, making good progress. I got the letter H cut, and I will put the H in, and I will save the fall off piece because I've got this space inside the H. And same thing with the O, or the C, I should say. This, it's called the counter. This part of the letter C, I need to put back in. So I will glue this, tack it right in place like that, so that the grain will be exactly where it came out. Not that it'll matter that much on this aspen. It's a real light colored wood with very little bit of grain, but all those details add up. All right, so here you can see I got those pieces glued in temporarily, just tiny little dabs of glue just to tack them, right? And then I got I made copies of these, and you can see, I think you can see I've got a few holes cut out where I can just put this in place and line it up. And I can tape that, and then now I can cut these two letters, the negative part or the counter of the C and the H. Yeah. If you're interested in learning this technique, I have a tutorial. It's on a flash drive available off my website. In the kit, I provide just about everything you'll need, like the saw, the donkey, the pin vise and drill bits, the veneer pack, and much more. You provide a hammer, some tape, and some time. All right, good progress. This is a good overview of what has happened. Here's the pieces, the negative pieces, right? And those are just trash. And got that in. It doesn't look like much, and it even looks worse on the back with all the glue and everything. But once this is all cleaned up, especially this side, this cherry should just pop against the lighter aspen background. So now, all right, so we're getting ready to cut in the cross. You can see this index mark that I put on there originally to line up that grain. That way this grain just flows all the way through into these letters. Nobody would probably ever notice, but I do those things for me. I believe those little details are what make a piece harmonious and cohesive. This project was super fun because I was able to employ 3 different processes. I did some hand-cut marquetry. There will be some laser engraving, and then also some inlay work created with the shaper origin. So the majority of the insert piece and the cavity were both cut with an 1/8 inch router bit, and here I'm going to use a 1/32 bit to make those corners a little sharper. Okay, so here's the first cross that I cut, and it's a little too loose. I don't know if that shows up, but even though the grain matched the letters down below, which nobody's ever going to see, I just do that for myself in, constantly striving to become a better craftsman. Anyway, since that doesn't really matter, I went ahead and cut a new piece, and this one fits just right. I've been using a small sanding block. This has 180 grit sandpaper on it, and just touching up areas that feel a little tight till it's just ready to go in. So let's add some glue and slip that in place. Of course, you always want to put an index mark so you make sure and put it in the right orientation, because it can be a different shape from side to side. Yeah. One reason for using the shaper origin, I was able to charge the customer a little bit less because it's a faster process than cutting that in by hand. Crisscross. And here I just wanted to scrape off some of that excess paper because under pressure it'll bond really well. I suppose I could have used my vacuum bag, but for small pieces like this, just as easy to clamp. And I wanted to create the bottom with veneer on both sides of a substrate at the same time. I cut all the miters with the chop saw, ensuring a good quality 45 degrees, and then I used a shooting plane and shooting board to ensure that we were 90 degrees all the way across the joint. Nothing too tricky here, just using the bottom to size the height of the first cut in all the sides, and I like to set them all up so I make sure and cut them on the right side, right? The depth is nothing critical. I believe I went about halfway. I love this new zero clearance, and I have a new YouTube video on it soon. So here's a cool little trick, but first I need to set the blade height, which that's easy enough, yeah. All right, so I start by gauging the wall thickness, or more specifically, what will be left after the rebate is cut, yeah. And I can take that average and use a drill bit that's maybe a little under to set the fence just right. This works extremely well, and now I can make the second cut for all the rebates, and in the words of my buddy Philip Morley, just perfect. At this point, a quick finish sand on the inside of the box parts. I see a lot of people utilizing this technique of where we're just going to put all these against a known straight edge, right? And you can see how perfect these line up. There's no gap. So we know that the miters are going to be nice and clean. Now, one thing that I see a lot of people doing is they'll put tape across these corners, right? And that's good because as we add the glue, that's going to create a nice, beautiful corner. However, there's one problem. All right, so we're using a PVA glue, just regular woodworking glue. It's water-based. And so what happens is when that water hits those fibers, those apex or those sharp miters, they will expand. They will expand with glue and open up. So if you have areas that aren't taped, those areas can open up and you can have these flared corners. If you look at that under magnification, you would see how those corners are slightly opened up. And so if you tape all the way across, that will prevent that. Just something to think about. Oftentimes it's these little subtle differences that don't take much longer in the scheme of things that produce a much better, cleaner result. Built-in tabs, right? I'm going to bring this up on top so that I can tear this clean. So I had to do voiceover here and cut some of the shop sounds because my neighbor was having a tree cut and they had leaf blowers going, chainsaws, all that jazz, so it got pretty noisy. Oh, and I wanted to add clear packing tape also works really well for pulling miters tight. Then we can check the inside corners. Beautiful and tight, beautiful and tight. That one's beautiful. Small gap right here. So rather than using a clamp, I'm going to use a web clamp, and then we can check it for square and let it dry. So I had two corners that were giving me a slight resistance, so added a band clamp, and then boxes like this or drawer boxes, I like weighting them down on something flat. That way that'll remove any twist if there's any. All right, this is actually straight off the saw, and it was too tight. I made it slightly big, but with a hand plane, I put a small angle, tiny, maybe 1/2 degree, 1 degree. You can see this inside is just a little bit more clear. You can see where the pencil lines disappeared, and it just engages, right? That direction, that direction. So it just barely fits, but it's tight. We don't want to force that. We could bust a miter open. So now what I'll do is a couple more swipes with a block plane just to clean up any of this. There's really not even saw marks. I used a pretty good blade, but you could also use a sanding block and then just sneak up on a perfect fit. You know, this being slightly beveled is not going to hurt anything. You'll never see it, and we're going to have plenty of glue on this part of the rebate. So yeah, that's one way to sneak up on a beautiful, perfect fit. That's just going in, and that would work. I put a little X here as an index mark so I would know which way this went, but it literally will go either way. It's that good of a fit. Everything is nice and square and accurate. And incidentally, at this point, only the inside has been sanded, because when we created this rabbit, remember, this is just slightly proud. So there's no need to sand this and then have to sand it again. This veneer is thin, so we want to sand it as little as possible. I like noting glue up times, and I know that I can come back in about an hour or so and continue. So here I'm adding what will look like an inlay when the product is done, but it's a simple matter of adding banding all the way around the perimeter of this lid. And I'm using some 1/32 strips of veneer. I'll add a strip on each opposite edge, and they're slightly longer than the width of the lid, and also proud of the thickness, of course. We'll tape those in place, let that dry. Then I can go work on something else, and after about an hour or so, I can come back and flush up those ends to where they're just right. And then I can add the long strips of veneer in place. After the perimeter strips of veneer are dried, then we can add the perimeter trim, and boom, it'll look like we have an inlay. The profile on the foot and the trim around the lid are both the same. However, the foot trim gets routed before it goes in place for obvious reasons. And the profile around the lid, it gets routed last. That way, the height of the profile is exact all the way around. All right, so this bottom is slightly recessed. I mean, just barely, but I don't need to flush that up just yet, because I'm going to add this foot detail, right? And so I can put that just about flush with the bottom of the sides. And then once the glue dries, we can flush up all of this at once. You may have noticed that I wanted to put the bottom in, let that get cured, secured, dried, glued, right? And then cut the splines. That way the box is a little bit stronger as I'm handling it here at the table saw. Oh, and incidentally, when you're cutting splines at the table saw, you should always use a flat top grind table saw blade. It'll make much cleaner cavities for the splines. All right, at this point, I ran some of this aspen through the joiner / planer, right? And then on one edge, I hit this with a hand plane. So these two corners are nice and crisp. I've marked this edge all along the edge before I cut it into small pieces. And I know that those edges will have saw cuts, so those will go out. And just about perfect fit, maybe a little tight. If they're a little bit too tight, I can just lightly hit them with some 180. We'll add glue and grab a big hammer. Perfect. All right, we're gonna cut the splines, but we don't want to touch the side of the box, right? So I've got this jig, I guess, and it's just past the blade a little bit. Can't use the fence because we need to just index off the sides of the box. So I can just run that against there like that. Let's give it a go. Don't be hating. It's fast and effective. What can I say? There was a test on, I believe in Fine Woodworking magazine, where they did hand plane and then sanded or braided, and then what the finish looked like after the project was complete. The overall difference was negligible. Oftentimes on a piece, I will use a hand plane if I can hand plane all of the surfaces. If I can't, then I will sand, because typically I can sand all the surfaces. Here I'm finishing with 180 and I'm done. There's nothing else to do. So truly what it comes down to is what makes you happy when you're in the shop, right? And yes, a belt sander makes me happy. All right, piece of 180 grit glued to my table saw, and I just want to clean up these edges and get everything nice and even. That looks pretty good. One little low spot. That's testament to quality miters, right? That's about all it took. I could probably use something finer. And sure, you could use a hand plane for this, but I find this faster. Yeah, that's it. So the trim around the bottom of the box and around the perimeter of the lid, that was all cut with a chop saw. You could use a table saw, I suppose, but the cuts straight off the chop saw were so clean, I could have just left them as is. I did follow up those cuts with a shooting board and a shooting plane, just because this wood is so white and there's absolutely no place to hide. I'll be sharing another YouTube video on my process soon and show you some really cool tips to make absolutely perfect miters. All right, with a little detail installed all the way around the bottom, this has been sanded, top is sanded. We can now sand the top and get all of this flush, get rid of some of this glue, right? Whoops. Squeezy. Okay. You can see that now I can flush everything up at the same time, rather than sanding the bottom of the box flush and then coming back to sand again. I love sharing my processes for sanding because it is so effective. So here I'm using 150 grit with a belt sander just to get everything nice and flush and just close to finish sanded. Then I follow up with 180 with DA. The DA will remove any cross grain scratches and final sand. And that's it. Sanding complete. I really don't know how you would do that faster. I mean, this is veneer, so I mean, you could use a hand plane. You just have to be careful with this thin commercial veneer. But yeah, that looks good. Flush. Miters are tight. We're getting there. I will admit, not all belt sanders are created equal, and a belt sander needs to be tuned up to perform optimally. The bottom platen needs to be flat. I like using graphite instead of the plate and cork that some sanders come with. I have several YouTube videos on the incredible belt sander. Yeah, you should check them out. All right, the first stage of sanding the top is done, and I can take this outside and route a profile. You'll notice I'm doing climb cuts, right? Super important at this stage. To have a tear out or a blowout would be, well, it wouldn't be the end of the world, but it wouldn't be good. So climb cuts to start, and I'll go all the way around. Recently, I was working on a dashboard with my father-in-law, and he was asking me, why do you go through all the trouble to sand that edge? Most of that's going to get routed off with the profile. Well, here's why. All those edges have also been sanded smooth, really smooth. That way you get rid of any little imperfection, saw cut, mill marks from the joiner or planer. All that would transfer to that profile if you don't do that. So that's just a good little tip to keep in mind when you're routing. Make sure that everything's been sanded clean and smooth. You'll create a smooth path for that tiny little bearing to ride on. Using the clean face of the top as a reference, I can make all the edging the same height, and then I will finish sand the entire thing. Well, that's about it. And you know, the older I get, it seems like the more urns I make. I've made quite a few now, and it's always such an honor to make something so special for someone. The laser engraving was done by my beautiful friend Bonnie. She does my emblems and some other work for me. The bottom of the lid came out tight, clean, and crisp, as did the splines and the miters. Working with species that are so contrasting leaves little room for forgiveness, but that challenge should be part of the fun. Rest in peace, Brother Chris. Making this box for you and your family was truly an honor, and thank you all so much for watching.